Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up. This is our Fireside chat at Wickford on the Water. My name is Dan Hersey, and I'm the founder of the Rhode Island Bitcoin Policy Institute, the RIBPI, and a moderator for tonight's conversation. First, I do want to thank Andrew and the Rhode Island Bitcoiners group, as well as the Rhode Island Blockchain Council for co-hosting this event with us and for all the work that they're doing to make Rhode Island a leader in blockchain innovation. I also want to thank this venue, Wickford on the Water, for giving us the perfect place to gather, talk, and learn together tonight. Quick note, as you might notice, this event is being recorded, so hi everyone, watching a little later on. For those who may not know the RIBPI, we are Rhode Island's homegrown, nonpartisan think tank and advocacy organization dedicated to advancing smart Bitcoin policy in this state. We work with legislators, regulators, and local communities to bring Bitcoin education to the public sphere and help Rhode Island position ourselves at the forefront of responsible innovation. From crafting forward-thinking legislation like Rhode Island Senate Bill 451 to co-hosting educational meetups like this, the RIBPI is committed to empowering Rhode Islanders with the tools and the knowledge needed to build a stronger, a fairer, and a more resilient financial future. So, shameless plug, thank you all for supporting all of our work by being here tonight. But without further ado, the real reason why we're here, I am thrilled to introduce our guest, Jason Maier, author of the newly revised edition.
Thank you.
A newly revised edition of A Progressive's Case for Bitcoin, A Path Towards a More Just and Peaceful World. Jason is a Connecticut-based math teacher who discovered Bitcoin through a mathematical lens and went on to explore its social and political implications from a progressive perspective. His updated edition includes new data, new case studies, and timely reflections on why Bitcoin deserves serious attention from anyone who cares about justice, equity, environmental sustainability, and economic empowerment. The revised edition was released in November and is now available on your site.
Yeah. BitcoinProgressive.com.
BitcoinProgressive.com. So without further ado, let's give another warm Rhode Island welcome to Jason Maier. Right. So I figure it's easy to start at the beginning. We all start at the beginning of our journey, right? We all talk about where, but you've been a math teacher for 20 years.
Yeah.
You're not a developer, you're a computer developer, you're not a Wall Street investor. So how did you, as an educator and progressive, first discover Bitcoin? So what was your aha moment that got you into this?
Yeah, there's a few, right? There's a few false starts too, and I'm sure that's true for everyone in Bitcoin. I think I had a slush pool account in 2012 and forgot about it, and it didn't do anything. And then many years later, like you said, I'm a math teacher. I teach math at a high school level. And a buddy of mine just literally sent me a text and was like, hey, you should think about Bitcoin. And I hadn't really in any real way. This guy is my best friend, was before and is still now. He's also the smartest person that I know in real life. He's also the weirdest person that I know in real life. I said, if this guy's suggesting Bitcoin, maybe I should look into it. And that night I was giving my son a bath and I was just glued to my phone. I was not paying attention to him at all, which I regret mildly, but I was learning and I just couldn't stop learning, right? And so as you say, I'm a math teacher. I went to graduate school for mathematics. I've always wanted to be a high school level math teacher. It was my childhood dream and I'm living it out. I'm also a self-taught coder, so I'm not a developer or anything, but I like solving problems, and computer science kinds of problems are fun for me. So I had an avenue into understanding Bitcoin and what a blockchain is and all of that stuff at that level, and immediately was drawn into it as soon as I started thinking deeply about it. I think that there's many aha moments when you start learning. You go down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin. And I've never said this in public before, so you guys get I remember the toilet I was sitting on when I learned there was a 21 million cap on Bitcoin, right? I just, oh my God. So, that was one aha moment. There was many others, but I think that just having enough of a mathematical background, enough of a computer science background to understand, wow, this is solving new problems that have never been solved before this. and just appreciating the beauty, the complexity, how it can work and how it works was really, that journey was really fulfilling, and my life hasn't been the same since. So.
Awesome. Now, we're going to get a little bit into some of the core themes of your book. And one of those is social justice, right? So you argue Bitcoin empowers poor, marginalized communities. And a lot of people might find that counterintuitive, right? A lot of people think, oh, it's a volatile asset. I mean, I have coworkers at work that will say this. It's a volatile asset, and it's something that only rich people use to get richer. Right? It's like it's a common theme that is said by people that may not necessarily understand it. So how do you portray, and I don't want to give away too much of the book, obviously we got copies here for you after this, but how can Bitcoin help ordinary people, right? Maybe those who've been left out of the current financial system, and in your opinion, in your elevator pitch, what is that social justice case for Bitcoin?
I mean, there's a lot, and it's a whole book full. But I think, at its core, one of the value propositions of Bitcoin is sort of its limited supply cap. You know that it is the first verifiably digitally scarce thing in the world. And there isn't the kind of inflation that we see that people are struggling with right now out in the real world. The observation, which again was counterintuitive to me when I started my journey, which is, wow, like inflation actually hurts poor people, working class people way more than it hurts, affluent and rich people. And that inflation is sort of like chipping away at the purchasing power of people who need it the most. So at the very basic level, Bitcoin offers an alternative that is sort of a hedge against that inflation, for sure. As a long-term store of value. You mentioned the volatility. I think that there's no way around that. We're trying to do a price discovery for a new monetary asset, which hasn't happened since, in this sort of natural, decentralized way for thousands of years. So you're going to expect a lot of volatility. And so it is important to give people good advice, like make sure that if you're buying Bitcoin as an investment, as a store of value, that you're thinking long-term, 4 or 5 year time horizons, and you're not spending money that you're going to need before then. The other thing is, and there's a lot more. I'll just mention maybe another example, which is, a lot of people who are starting out in life right now in their 20s, trying to enter into adulthood, having trouble finding affordable housing, can't find homes, are priced out of the market, those kinds of things, because our money is broken. And a lot of people don't see or think about that aspect one level deeper, right? They're told a narrative like, oh, this is why housing is so expensive. This is why homes cost too much. But really, it's because people are using homes or their houses as stores of value. It's because our money's broken. Like one of the, the use cases of money is to store value, and dollars don't do that. You need to do something else. And if you have people buying houses just for a store of value, or you're buying their second or third homes for investment properties and things like that, then regular people just starting out are having trouble affording that. So with that in mind, you can buy 50 cents worth of Bitcoin right now, right? And you don't need to buy a whole house worth of Bitcoin or something like that. People who don't have a lot of disposable income, who are able to bring in more than they spend and doing the right thing by trying to save, it is another vehicle and doesn't have the prohibitive hurdles that like owning a property would necessarily, right? It kind of gives people a shoe in, like a toe into that avenue, and you don't need to necessarily be able to get a mortgage or spend $500,000 to something like that. So I think there's a lot of other ways in which Bitcoin kind of helps social justice causes and aligns with progressive values, but certainly giving financial opportunity to people who don't have it, or who are marginalized or outside of this system, or can't get a bank account, or don't have access to the same financial institutions that wealthy people do. All of those are absolutely critically important use cases for Bitcoin.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I think there's a lot of people that would agree that money is broken, even those that aren't necessarily in the Bitcoin sphere, haven't swallowed the orange pill. And I think that on top of that, they know money's broken, they don't know what the antidote is. And so this is, again, a great use case for what that antidote would be. Another big topic is the environment, right? And I know that progressives do care deeply about climate change, and Bitcoin gets a bad rap, sometimes very negatively, for its energy use. Critiques are like, oh, Bitcoin uses as much electricity as a small country, right? But you take a different view. And in fact, I don't want to give away chapter names, but chapter 3 is literally titled, Why Bitcoin is Good for the Environment. Good for the environment. That's a bold claim, right? Can you explain for everyone here how Bitcoin can be environmentally beneficial, and what's the argument that Bitcoin, of all things, might help us reduce carbon emissions or even drive green innovation?
Yeah, it's a critically important issue, right? If I'm trying to pitch Bitcoin to people who aren't already into it, and they do have this stance that they care about the environment. They hear a narrative in the mainstream media or from politicians about Bitcoin being harmful to the environment. It's important to address that. Chapter 3 that you just mentioned is the longest chapter in the book, and it's the one that I spent sort of the most time researching and was most careful about. And so it's important. I do think since the book came out originally, AI data centers have taken sort of the heat off of Bitcoin a little bit. So like I'm sort of like, mildly happy that Bitcoin doesn't get such a bad rap. There's some other boogeyman out there, but even in comparison to AI data centers or other users of electricity, Bitcoin is unique, and I mean that in the precise mathematical definition of the word. It's unique in terms of energy consumers because it's location agnostic. It can dial up and dial down perfectly in sync with demands that the network is providing, the electrical grid is providing. So with Bitcoin, you have a situation where you get users who are location agnostic, willing to go anywhere to use the cheapest, most reliable energy that they can, even if there isn't a demand for it already. So you mentioned renewable green energy sources. A lot of those are located right now in places where there aren't people to use the electricity. So Bitcoin can serve as sort of a bridge to help monetize that electricity generation. It's done at a dam or in a solar, or wind, all of these things where there's plenty of generation happening, but not a lot of demand, and Bitcoin can monetize that. And incentivize that build out, because if we want to electrify things and make just our entire grid more green, we're going to need to do that. And it also helps stabilize the grid, as I mentioned. So if you have a reliable user of electricity who's willing to turn off immediately when you ask, it's automatic. It just happens instantaneously. So if there's a heat wave or there's some other need for consumers to use the electricity, Bitcoin miners will turn off naturally. They're incentivized to do that. And so you have this great stabilization property. You have the monetization of electricity that's being generated in places where there isn't really like a consumer base to use it. You see this even in Africa and things like that right now, where there's villages where there's no electricity demand because there's never been electricity. And then you bring in to a renewable source, some hydro project, and you use Bitcoin mining to help monetize that and get it off of the ground. So it's a lot more complicated. I think I talk in the book about the fact that like using energy isn't bad necessarily. It's important. Using energy is important. Just sort of like wasting energy or being more efficient about energy uses are important considerations. And that's a subtle argument. I think it's easier to sort of go on TV and say using energy is bad, as opposed to what you're using it for, how efficient are you being responsive to the grid? All of those things are more subtle, but certainly worthy of the conversation.
Yeah, that's great. And I know you talked a bit about the Texas debacle that happened a few years ago, and we can get into that. That's in the book. But the third piece is corruption and the financial system. And I think this is the part that most people get, no matter where they fall on the political spectrum. You describe Bitcoin as the, quote, protest against too big to fail banks and a way to inject more integrity into finance. And this is another angle that some people may not necessarily consider. But can you talk about how Bitcoin serves as a check on the abuses or inequalities of our current financial system? For instance, how does it address issues like bank bailouts? I know 2008 is the eve of which why everybody's in this room right now. But what that corporate influence over money looks like, or the, quote, too big to fail problem, which was banks and may now be more tech. I mean, with the government buying a 10% stake in Intel, for example, is tech potentially the next too big to fail? So how does Bitcoin address some of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point, right? If we sort of study our history of Bitcoin, we know that Bitcoin was sort of developed and released right in the aftermath of the Great Financial Crisis and all of that in 2008. And it's hard to ignore sort of the coincidence of the timing there, right? And of course, we know that Satoshi left messages in the Genesis block to that effect. So I think that understanding, you say like this is something that everybody can relate to just despite whatever their political leanings are. And I think it's true. I think most people know that there's something wrong. They feel something's wrong, and that's across the political spectrum. The world isn't going the way it's supposed to. I don't like the people in power. The system isn't working the way I want it to be working. But they really have trouble putting a finger on like what exactly is wrong. So what exploring Bitcoin allows you to do is kind of like go that one level deeper, which is, move past the political narratives that your party is telling you is causing the trouble and say, okay, well, the money is broken at the very beginning. And so like one example of that is, this Cantillon effect, which we talk about in the book and a lot of Bitcoiners have heard about, which is, the very nature in which money is created in our current system, in our current financial system, favors the well-connected and the people who are closest to the big banks. And so that's corporations, wealthy individuals, those kinds of entities that actually get the money first and can buy scarce resources with it before that money trickles through the economy and causes inflation. That system is how it is right now. And so by, if you think about Bitcoin in comparison to that, and you have an absolutely transparent system, everybody knows how Bitcoin is created. Everybody has the ability to study it, check the code, and understand it. And not one individual is favored because of how much Bitcoin they have. So it's good to have more Bitcoin than not, but certainly by having more Bitcoin, it doesn't allow you to affect the process by which Bitcoin is created. And the same cannot be said of dollars. So there's an equity issue there. I think that the transparency and the openness of the protocol and the network also has intersections with the government. And so if you feel like, if you knew where your tax money was going on the blockchain, you can kind of follow it and hold politicians accountable. That opens up a whole new world that we can't probably even understand right now about how to keep people accountable and how to keep our leaders accountable. So there's some transparency things going on there, and just a sort of fairness and equity issue of not any one person should have sort of the ability to have access to the money first, the way dollars are created right now. So
that's great. Talking a little bit more about some of the geopolitical ramifications of in your book, and not to give away too much, but you do discuss about how France, Germany, during World War I, some countries suspended their currency's gold backing. And this was back before Bretton Woods, right? So this was back when most currencies were backed by a hard metal, whether it was silver, whether it was gold, whatever it was backed by. I'm going to draw out a hypothetical here. Okay. So, but in a Bitcoin denominated world, right? And I guess in a deflationary world, not an inflationary world, how would that change the situation before a big war like this? Would wars be rendered obsolete? And with that said, couldn't one country still decide to print at will again? And what would be the result of that?
It was an interesting chapter to write, and I remember actually it was the first chapter I wrote. I also haven't shared that with anybody else. I was in bed with COVID and I was just typing on my computer. And I said, France suspended the gold standard when they were invaded by Germany and to start World War, during World War I in that time frame. And I wonder how long it took the other countries to suspend the gold standard to print money to go to war. And it was like 2 or 3 days.
2 days.
Right? Yeah. And so, like you have this concept that, when you go to war, the real distinction here is like, I draw it carefully in the chapter I talk about it in the book, is if you think back to the history of World War II, for example, there were a lot of things asked on the populace to sort of sacrifice. There was a draft, there were people going to war, there was new taxes, there was war bonds, there was rationing, right? So the cost of war was felt by the people. And that means, like, if you're fighting a war that's the people support, and like, this is a good thing to fight for, and I support this, and I'm willing to not have butter for, however long, or, I can only have 3 eggs, and I'm going to pay more taxes, and I'm okay with that, then the government can fund that war and go to war. And now, in my adult lifetime, we've been at war all over the place, and I've not felt any pain, right? Like my taxes haven't gone up, they've gone down. I'm not really asked to buy war bonds. I'm not being drafted. All of those things are happening now, and these wars go on forever, and they're called the forever wars. And part of the argument is, if people feel the pain of war that's happening someplace else, either through blood or treasure, then an educated and involved populace can hold their government accountable and say, we don't want to be doing this. This is not helpful for us. It's not what we want. And since World War II, that's never happened, right? Like we're just printing money to fund these wars and to pay the companies that make the weapons, to all of this stuff. So I think that the argument is that you need to get and I say in the book, this is aspirational, right? Like we don't know how it would work for real. We can do some thought experiments. The minute you get the tank making company to only want Bitcoin because the dollar is being inflated away and not useful anymore, or the mark or the euro or whatever, that's when you win, right? If the tank making company says, or the fighter jet making company or whatever it is says, we only want Bitcoin, then the government can't print that, right? And they have to decide, all right, well, we're going to go into debt and issue some sort of bond. We're going to raise taxes. We're going to take money away from something else. And if the population says, yeah, that's good, like we understand, we're going to sacrifice because this war is really important, then it can still happen. But if it's some spurious thing that doesn't make any sense and it's just making certain people rich and killing a lot of poor people, then maybe the populace can fight back against it. So that's the idea.
Does the company rhyme with Lockheed Martin? No. It's interesting because if you go back ever since World War II, it seems like there hasn't actually been a war that has been won. I mean, arguably.
Well, there hasn't been a war declared either, right? Yeah.
Right.
And that's all part of it, right? Like you think, what are you asking of the population in the country when we're going to war? And if the answer is nothing, then that just means that wars are happening more and longer and deadlier and more costly.
So let's look at, your book is explicitly framed for a progressive audience, but if we look at the federal level, a lot of prominent progressive leaders have been critical of Bitcoin, right? So for an elephant in the room here, or donkey in the room. But for example, some in Congress worry it's used by criminals. They see it as enabling anti-government libertarian ideas. There's one senator talking about building an anti-crypto army as part of her platform. So given this, you address this elephant as Bitcoin has a long-standing history of being looked at more favorably by the other side of the political spectrum. And you argue that rather than necessarily ceding Bitcoin to folks like Trump, progressives should double down on it. And can you share a bit about that argument? And what do you think is, more importantly, what do you think is at stake if Bitcoin becomes seen as, quote, Trump's thing? And how do you suggest progressives respond to that?
And this, what you're touching on is really the whole point that I wrote the book in the first place. And so it's important for me to say, I guess, like the book is written for the lay person, right? It's written for the voter, not like a politician. And just for people who are interested in Bitcoin and are turned off by sort of the rhetoric that's on Twitter, for example, or, sort of the mainstream pop culture of Bitcoin seems a little bit off-putting. So that's the target audience of the book. But it was done in a way that says, man, we're really close to this sort of tipping over the edge of turning into a thing that's for the other 40% of the country and not for my 40% of the country. That was the intention behind writing the book. Let's not have that happen. And I sit here today and I'm not sure if that's happened yet or not. I'm kind of hoping it hasn't, but you can make an argument that it has. But the idea that one of the things that I noticed, because I've gone to Capitol Hill a few times, I've talked to senators and Congress people, I've talked to their staff about Bitcoin, I've handed them copies of my book. One of the promising, hopeful things that I've noticed is that it seems to be more of a generational thing than necessarily like a political party thing. There's a lot of young Democratic representatives who are in the government and the federal level who are open to the idea of Bitcoin, who are okay with it. They don't necessarily have sort of the political clearance from the older guard necessarily to do that or to advocate for it strongly. So I'm hopeful that that's true. That seems to be the case. And I do think that there's an argument to be made that Bitcoin stands up for a lot of progressive ideals that Democrats say that they care about. And so if you can continue to make that argument, then hopefully it will sink in, or people like Elizabeth Warren will, who has pretty much unanimously have said bad things about Bitcoin, but not like exclusively. I think that maybe it's starting to crack, although I'm not hopeful on that front. But the people who are in the next generation of the Democratic leadership will rise up. The big fear, of course, and one of the main instigators to me releasing the second edition of the book is the idea that it becomes a Trump thing, right? Which unfortunately, the political reality in our country right now is that if it gets labeled as a Trump thing or viewed in the popular narrative as a Trump thing, then people aren't even going to consider it. They're not going to listen to like a subtle, intricate argument about why Bitcoin isn't really that evil. They're just going to make up their decision immediately. And so the goal of releasing the second edition is maybe to speak to that a little bit as a primary goal, to say, this is something that actually is beneficial. It stands up for your progressive values. It makes the world a better place. And just because this one man likes it doesn't mean that you should just dismiss it immediately. But I do think that there's a real risk of having Bitcoin become a Trump thing and shutting out 60% of the country who's just going to dismiss it out of hand.
So I just want to go into your home state of Connecticut, right? And I know there was a bill that was passed that's very anti-digital asset in nature. And what do you think that your home state is missing currently when you look at Bitcoin through this lens?
So Connecticut is dropped the ball, right? Absolutely. That's why I'm here in Rhode Island for the day. So here's what I'll say, which I think is an important point to make for people who are really into Bitcoin and just think, well, Democrats are idiots because they're dropping the ball on this and they're passing this legislation. If you are guided in your life with the heuristic that when somebody is telling you something complicated about money and the internet, that is a scam and you need to be careful about it, then you will be right 99% of the time, right? Like 99.9% of the time. And so I think if I give the biggest benefit of the doubt I can to the people who are passing this kind of legislation, it's that they're operating on that heuristic, right? This is clearly not good. Some people are getting really rich off of it. It's hurting other people and not thinking critically about it. And if you're operating from that just basic heuristic, then you're going to be right 99.9% of the time. And it's hard to make the argument, well, Bitcoin is the one exception, right? Let's look closely at it. So I do want to give at least a little bit of credit to like that idea. Now, you don't have to agree with it. If you're already into Bitcoin, you think maybe you just think, well, they haven't done their homework or something like that. But there's a lot, right? These are politicians who have probably 200 things that they have to care about and know about, and they don't, right? There's no way that they could possibly exert on everything. So I think that I want to give a little bit of credit. But there are plenty of states who are getting it right or doing better. And so I think that that's my answer to what are the people in Connecticut missing, I think, and what is Elizabeth Warren missing, right? Like, I think that's my answer. I think it's just very well-intentioned, like, and a lot of Bitcoiners say it's sort of paternalistic. We need to protect people from this scam. Maybe that kind of rubs people the wrong way. I understand that too. But kind of like saying, this probably isn't good. And so instead of spending 100 hours learning about it, I'm just going to say it's probably not good. And I find that unfortunate, but I think that's the reality.
Well, we are here in Rhode Island, so I do want to bring the focus back to the state, as there are exciting things that are happening across your border, which feel free to spend more time than one night here. We're happy to have you.
Yeah, I'm having fun.
I think we've punched a little bit above our weight when it comes to policy innovation. As mentioned earlier, I authored Senate Bill 451 in Rhode Island, which is a de minimis tax exemption. Of course, it didn't quite make it out of committee, but we have a companion bill that's going to be released in the next legislative session. And what's even more interesting is who sponsored the bill, which was my Senator Pete Apollonio, who is a Democrat. And also just so happens that all 5 of the bills that have to do with Bitcoin and blockchain innovation were either sponsored or co-sponsored by Democrats in the state. And I know you're not a Rhode Islander, but given that, what is your take on this development? And do you see Rhode Island as a potential model for how states, and especially blue-leaning states, could embrace Bitcoin in a pragmatic or progressive-friendly way?
Yeah, and I think that's probably the only way it can go. I don't really get a good feeling from sort of a federal top-down sort of way. We have already our federalist system is decentralized in a very explicit way for states to sort of experiment and be the sandbox for policy. You mentioned something interesting because a lot of Bitcoiners will get excited. Oh, Trump is saying something about the strategic Bitcoin reserve, and the federal government's going to buy all this Bitcoin. Like, that's way less important than a de minimis tax exemption, right? Like, if you can go out and spend your Bitcoin on a cup of coffee and not have it be a taxable event, that's way more useful for what we want to have happen, right? And so those kinds of things, or protecting miners from operating in your state, whatever state that is, but in Rhode Island, or those kinds of things are practical, as you say, very pragmatic, right? This is just what we need in terms of sort of common sense legislation. Maybe you have consumer fraud, you want to protect people, I get that. But also sort of let people use their money the way they want, right? Buy a beer, buy a coffee with your Bitcoin, and not have it be a taxable event. I'm way more excited about something like that than sort of a federal strategic Bitcoin reserve, right? Which theoretically doesn't do anything, but we'll put that aside. But what I'll say is that these states, it's interesting because you get this narrative online like, oh, well, the Democrats are anti-Bitcoin, the Republicans are for Bitcoin. But you just mentioned like a lot of the stuff happening in Rhode Island is from Democrats. And Rhode Island isn't the only state, right? Like there's a bill that still exists in California at the state level that does a lot of property protections and things like that for Bitcoin. And that's also sponsored by Democrats. And so what we need to do is sort of change the narrative, because when this pops up on Twitter, oh, these Democrats in California are trying to steal your Bitcoin, that's not what they're doing. It's just like sort of a knee-jerk reaction. Like they must not like it. It must be anti-Bitcoin, and it's from a blue state like California, right? And so I think we just need to change the narrative, because that upsets me more than anything else. So, oh, well, it must be anti. It's like, no, they're actually trying to get companies and like the state to be able to accept Bitcoin and protect it if your account goes idle, so like the company can't take your Bitcoin. Like this is good things. It's not like they're trying to do anything harmful. So, and reasonable people can disagree about the details of policy, but just don't assume that it's going to be negative. So it could be back to the point that we made earlier about sort of a generational thing. Maybe young people in the state legislatures right now, even if they're Democrat, are seeing that this is important and needs to happen. And the old guard at the federal level is not. And so that's where we are right now.
Yeah, and so I think that kind of gets to my next question, which has more to do with if you think it ends up being more beneficial from a top-down or a bottom-up approach, more of a grassroots movement. I know that when we talk about progressives, one of the first names people think of is Bernie Sanders, and of course he had a very his grassroots campaign from Vermont that really swept the nation almost 10 years ago now. The question becomes, do you think that from a progressive standpoint, Bitcoin can take the same level of a grassroots campaign, or how does this work?
Yeah, I think that's the best way to do it, right? I think by sort of ethos, Bitcoin is decentralized. It's not meant to be sort of a centralized top-down thing to begin with. And that aligns perfectly well with progressive values, right? This idea that you're talking about with Bernie Sanders and this grassroots momentum fighting against the Democratic Party establishment, like that really speaks to progressive values quite a bit. So there's an alignment there. I think that having sort of actors within the federal government provide Bitcoin policy through executive order that can just be undone by the next person is not a sustainable way to do policy, right? I think it needs to be a bipartisan approach. I think it needs to have grassroots support. I think states are a perfect place for that to happen first, absolutely. I think, ideally, you see it sweeping across the nation at the state level, and then the federal government has to respond and have sensible policy. Having one person decide, well, we're going to do this or we're going to do that, and have it just be executive order, that stuff, if it's that easy to put into place, it's that easy to get rid of. And so I think that we just need to have bipartisan support, and having it be at the state level first is ideal. Now, I don't get to decide that, obviously. So we need to deal with the realities on the ground. But if you're asking my preference or what I think was better for Bitcoin in the long run, I definitely think sort of a decentralized state level grassroots campaign is way more beneficial.
Perfect. Now, one reason this event is timely, because as you see here, there's this beautiful blue strip at the bottom of the book that says new, revised, updated edition. And it has a lot of fresh content. And obviously a lot has changed in the last couple of years since you released the initial edition. Just to give everyone a tease, can you highlight some of the additions or what you're most excited about that's been added or expanded upon?
Yeah, so I think that everything that could be updated was updated. So you're talking about like statistics on the environmental impact or the efficiency of miners. All of that has been updated, and including a treatment of some of the laws that have passed since I wrote the first one. I mean, when I wrote the first one and it was released, there were no ETFs. There was no like Bitcoin, strategy wasn't like stockpiling Bitcoin or anything like that. There was no strategy. It was MicroStrategy back then, right? So a lot's changed. So I try to address all of those things and give people a sense. But really, and I mentioned this in passing before, it was mentioned before, I think Andrew said, like the book, most people buy the book, I think, from anecdotally from what I hear, is like for other people. This is a great gift for your mom or your sister, some woman in your life usually, who is curious about Bitcoin, or you want them to be curious about Bitcoin. And it didn't seem right to have a progressive case for Bitcoin that doesn't explicitly reference the fact that like Trump has come out as pro-Bitcoin. And what does that mean for you as sort of a progressive person who's handed this book as a learning resource, and somebody who loves you very much wants you to learn about Bitcoin, but you've only been hearing that it's a Trump thing, right? And so I think that what I'm trying to do within the book and the new edition of the book is to address that. And I write about the experience in the preface of the second edition about going to Nashville and speaking on stage and talking about the concepts that are in this book that I wrote that I never thought anybody would ever read. And here I am on like the Bitcoin conference main stage talking to elected officials from the Democratic Party. And it should have been this moment of like, oh my God, it finally happened. Like I made it. Like this is amazing. But later that day, Trump got on the stage and talked about Bitcoin. I was like, oh no, everything I've worked for is crumbling in my hand. So I feel like that day was a bittersweet day to be in Nashville and to know that there were 15,000 people in the audience watching me speak on stage, but they were not there to see me. They were there to see Donald Trump and for him to ramble about Bitcoin or do whatever he was going to do. That was a bittersweet day for me. And that was sort of that's the day I said, all right, we're going to do a new edition. We're going to talk about this. And I think that I tried to do a careful job of updating, like I said, everything that could be updated, but also speaking to the person who's handed this book as a Christmas gift or whatever. Say, Mom, brother, I think you should get into Bitcoin and look at this resource. I wanted to make sure that it at least spoke to the idea that it's not a Trump thing. It existed before him, before he was into it, and it's going to exist after he's not into it anymore, and that it's important for everybody to learn about it.
So as we approach the end of the chat, and everyone's chomping at the bit to ask questions, we'll get there. I just want to zoom all the way out. So the subtitle of your book is A Path Towards a More Just, Equitable, and Peaceful World. And that really resonates, especially with progressives. And I think most of us in this room care about building a better future, right? One that's with justice and peace. And it's not every day that you hear that along with the word Bitcoin. It's not at the forefront of everybody's mind when they think Bitcoin. So let me ask you the question is, how do you see Bitcoin contributing to this just, equitable, and peaceful world? And if Bitcoin were widely adopted and principles widely adopted, if it was the base monetary layer of the future world that we currently live in, how could that advance causes like social justice, like equity, and like that peace?
Yeah, I mean, you might be the first person to ask me about the subtitle of the book, right? So that's great. And it's something that I thought of carefully, right? And I was very careful to say a path towards. And what I like to say is that Bitcoin is sort of step zero. You need to have good money that you can rely on as a store of, it works for all of the things, right? Medium of exchange, store of value, unit of count. And then you can go out and do the work that you have to do. So a lot of people, you'll hear this trope, okay, Bitcoin, fix the money, fix the world. I think that's a nice little tagline, but I would rather think of it as Bitcoin is step zero. Once you have the money fixed or you have a more reliable system in place, then you can go out and do the work of making the world more just, equitable, and peaceful. But it's not like just a button that you press. It's just setting you up to have the tools you need to do the work, right? So the people, my grandfather called them do-gooders, right? Like you go out and make the world a better place, but you need to be able to have money or transact or buy things or buy supplies. And a lot of places around the world right now, like you get, aid is confiscated, siphoned, taxed, confiscated, all of those things. Bitcoin allows people to go out and do good work, right? If you want communities to thrive and be vibrant, they need to have access to a financial system that's fair and transparent and not be locked out of a system, right? A lot of people in this room, if I said, hey, go buy stock X, Y, or Z right now, they could probably do it if they were inclined. But a lot of people in this country and around the world can't, right? And so there's a lot of people who are just excluded from the financial system as it exists right now. And creating a new one, I think, is step zero towards making the world a better place, but it's not like a guarantee. It's not a snap of the fingers. It's not a press a button. It just means there's more work to be done after that. So a path towards is just that, right? It's like if you can learn about this and if you can adopt this and if you can, within your sphere of influence, get people that more knowledgeable about it, then we could make the world a better place. As people who have progressive leaning values want to see it, but it's not a guarantee and it's not a promise. It's like a prescription for more work.
Perfect. Well, now let's open it up to everyone in the room. Set aside some time, next 15 or so minutes for audience questions. So feel free to ask Jason anything about his book, Bitcoin, progressive politics, whatever we covered tonight, or maybe it's something we didn't. So just project your voice if possible, and then I'll repeat the question if needed.
So I teach at the high school level. I taught Algebra 2 this morning before I drove here, right? So I'm like in it right now. As mentioned, my kids are getting ready for their midterms, and I'm here having a beer. So I'm happier than they are probably. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of intersection between math and Bitcoin. So there's some opportunities now. Usually high school age students right now, like when they hear that I wrote a Bitcoin book, or like, oh my God, I can't believe you're this like Bitcoin famous person or whatever. It's not, whatever. They get excited because they think, oh, there's a get rich quick scheme, right? Like, oh, just tell me, should I buy now or should I sell, whatever. So like, it takes a lot of work to unlearn that for them and say, well, this is not about getting rich quick. It's not about an investment necessarily. It's about sort of an infrastructure that's going to make the world better. They're not excited by that, but they think it's kind of cool that I wrote a book. What I do get to do is talk about Bitcoin concepts without necessarily labeling them as Bitcoin concepts, right? So, there's an example in recent memory where somebody was asking me about the square root symbol and how did they decide on that? And what if there's a better square root symbol? And so I got to talk about consensus and that there's no like governing body that decides this is the math symbols that we use. It's just sort of the community has decided and settled on. And if you have a better one and you can convince people to use those math symbols and it's tangibly better than you could. And so, I was talking all about this consensus mechanism by which we agree on which symbols to use in mathematics. And I knew what I was talking about. And then one kid goes, is this a Bitcoin thing? I was like, well, kind of. So, just sort of consensus mechanism in that instance. But digital scarcity, all these kinds of things pop up. And we do talk about it in the classroom. But one of the things that I would love to do if I had more time is write a high school level math textbook that is centered around Bitcoin, meaning that like you learn the high school level mathematics that you need to completely understand Bitcoin, right? Everything from like how do you know if there's a supply cap to how are the networks arranged and all of that stuff. So that's one of the things I would love to do is an intersection between my day job and Bitcoin. But surely the kids ask me a lot of questions that are centered around how to make a lot of money, and I dissuade them from that, and then we have a more in-depth conversation with the kids that are still around after that.
What a bottom-up decentralized currency would look like when it seems like that's at odds with progressive values. Essentially, at odds with a big state. Okay.
Yeah. So I think it's an excellent question, actually, and I don't know, maybe chapter 9 is where I talk about it. So I think there's a couple of things going on, right? Like the assumption that you take away the money printing capabilities of the state and therefore they can't do anything is maybe fun on Twitter, but I don't think it's perfectly accurate. I think that the role of the government would be much different and lessened. And my take on that means that people, an engaged populace gets to then prioritize what does the government spend money on, right? It's not as if the government doesn't have any money. It's just how do you spend money? You can't just spend it on everything and make everybody happy. And I think that adds transparency and accountability to our government. It doesn't necessarily mean that, so I'll put it this way. Progressive people that I know aren't necessarily into big government for the sake of like the concept of big government. They want government to do certain things. And so if the government has money that they get through taxation or some other mechanism and they can do certain things, then people are going to be happy with that. And if that means they have to get rid of the things that they don't like. So you have this dynamic where the politicians then are fighting for your attention because there's only a limited amount of money to spend. And who's going to win? Who's the priorities, right? The other piece of it, I draw a parallel, and a lot of people do, between sort of separation of church and state. Which, a few hundred years ago would seem totally bizarre. People couldn't wrap their head around that. And so I try to make sure that people understand, that was probably good for everybody. Most people would say that. And so, there are a lot of very powerful institutions within our society that influence how the world works and can do good or bad, and they don't print money. They don't print money. So like the fact that the government would be completely impotent, I don't necessarily buy that. I think it just means that you have to reprioritize. And just because you can't print money doesn't mean you can't influence for good or for ill. But I do think the question speaks to how do you get people into Bitcoin, right? And how do you talk in their language? How do you start them off on that journey? And if your first thing that you say to somebody and they're just not really into Bitcoin or they don't know a lot about it, like we need to end the Fed, you're lost. It's not, if that's your first sentence, it's probably going to be your last sentence, right? So it's like, so you need to be able to speak to their values. Where are they? What do they understand? How do they view the world? What are the problems that they see in the world? And the idea that just framing the language in that way, I think, is important. So I speak a lot more about it in the book, but those are the big takeaways on that front. Yeah.
The question was about cultural unity.
So you're right to point out that I get fired at from both sides. This is true. So progressive people who are not Bitcoiners don't like what I'm doing, and Bitcoiners who are conservative don't like what I'm doing. I get a lot of nasty things said about me on Twitter that I don't let my kids read. So you're right. I do think that what's interesting is that by positioning myself as a Bitcoiner, and in my day in, day out, I'm around people who agree with me politically about 99% of things, right? So like my day-to-day interaction, my family, my coworkers, my friends, These are all people who I could say any political statement and they would agree with me. And there's a lot of people in the world who live like that. And by becoming a Bitcoiner and sort of becoming a public figure in the Bitcoin space, more or less, it's really forced me to interact with people who don't agree with me, who don't see eye to eye with me. And more than anything else, it's really taught me that these people are a lot like me. They have the same concerns. They have the same desires for their family. They want the same things that I do now, not completely. But by and large, you can kind of see the common thread. So I think that one of the gifts that Bitcoin has given me is to step outside of my bubble. And I would love to be able to say like, okay, well, I'm not in a bubble anymore, but the truth is probably closer to now I'm in two bubbles. And so I get to hear both of them. And I'll come back and report things to people in my like normie life that I hear from like the Bitcoin space or like the more conservative corners of, and they can't even believe it. Are you kidding me? They're using that word? Like, yeah, they're using it. They're using that word. They think it's cool. And I'm like, no way. I can't believe it, right? So like, I get to see like two sides of it, which I think is really interesting. But to your point, it is an opportunity. There is a bridge there. There is to say, hey, there's some humanity between us. Like you want what's best for your family. I want what's best for my family. You know, like I want there to be a peaceful, world that we can live in. I want I want the environment to be taken care of. All these things are actually kind of like more universal than we're led to believe. And if we can get past sort of the rhetoric and the language that each side uses, it's easier to do that. And so I think that Bitcoin provides an opportunity. Hopefully the generational shift is coming. I think that there's a lot of people who are teenagers right now who don't think of Bitcoin or digital money or like stuff on a computer as weird at all. And so as these people grow and mature and start learning about this stuff, it will just become more normal. And then there's a chance for a bridge to happen. And again, I count that as one of the blessings that the Bitcoin community has given me is to be able to peer into like more than one bubble. And most people right now only get to have one bubble. When you think about the use cases of money, store of value, medium of exchange, unit of account, successful money does all three of those things, and they happen in that order. In order for something to have like gain adoption, it needs to be seen as a store of value. Good money, you can put your resources and your time into it. This is not. This one's the Venezuelan, right? The Bolivar. And so when money is broken, like society collapses, right? So like that's I think that my answer is yes to all of it, but in that order, right? So I'm not surprised that you have Strategy or 21 going out and buying a lot of Bitcoin, or people like normal everyday people just buying Bitcoin, putting it on a cold wallet and forgetting about it. And like, that's my store of value. That's my nest egg. That's for my kids. That's for my retirement. But as that happens more, then now I'm a baker who really wants to get more Bitcoin, then I'm going to start accepting Bitcoin, right? Or, I'm a math tutor on the side and I want more Bitcoin, I'm going to accept Bitcoin, right? So all of a sudden it just naturally evolves into a medium of exchange. And if enough people do that, then it becomes a unit of account because it's easier to just measure the things that you're transacting in this case, a Bitcoin or Sats. So my answer is yes, in that order, and I don't know the timeline, right? I do think that in order for Bitcoin to thrive, it needs to be used by, we were talking earlier before we started the talk about all the different places because of Square terminals, like companies can accept Bitcoin more easily now than they could 2 months ago, whenever it came out, when Jack Dorsey flipped that switch. I think that's good. I think that the more people are using Bitcoin, the better. But I don't think you have to pick one side or the other, to be honest with you. I think that both are viable, right? Like I have a lot of Bitcoin that I don't have a lot of Bitcoin. I have some Bitcoin that is locked away, and I have some that I'll use, right? If I have the opportunity, I like using Bitcoin. So I think
we're in a marina. It's all lost in the boating accident.
It's already lost. I don't even have it. It's all gone. So the answer is both, and in that order. That's a great question. And so I'll use it as an opportunity to do a quick plug of the Progressive Bitcoiner nonprofit that started in 2025. because I was just on a board of directors call with them. So they're not directly connected to the book or anything, but they asked me to be on the board of directors. It's a nonprofit that's all about Bitcoin education. And so we got to vote as board of directors today about, we have this grant that we're going to put out to people, like young people who are interested in Bitcoin projects. And so we got to do our final vote, and we're funding a couple of different projects. So I don't know, I can say too much about it, but I'm excited about anything that makes it easier to use Bitcoin in rural places around the world. So if that means like developing a new like NFC card technology that'd be used in Africa, like that's great. Anything that's, and so that might be funded right around the corner. Like check out progressivebitcoiner.org. Those kinds of things are exciting. I think that gridless and using like renewable energy sources to provide electricity to villages that did not have electricity before, like these pro-social use cases are absolutely like fundamental to the progressive idea of Bitcoin. It helps us talk to politicians. It helps us talk to voters about like the good that can happen. There isn't another technology that can go into a remote village in Africa and provide electricity, from a river, the way that Bitcoin can, right? And so I think that those are all good examples. Another one that there's a number of people working on that hasn't gotten off the ground yet, but I would like to see more of, is an education and donation program about victims of domestic violence, intimate partner violence. I mentioned as a example in the book, 99% of people who are victims of domestic violence are also victims of financial abuse, meaning that they don't have access to the household accounts, they don't know where the money is, they don't know how to access it. If they leave, they'll have nothing. And that's one of the main reasons that people stay in abusive relationships. So working with women's support services and women's shelters and to provide like a way for somebody to save money that is that can't be confiscated or frozen, and give somebody a new starting like head start if they decide to leave a violent relationship would be a great use case for Bitcoin. And I know 2 or 3 different groups that are starting to work on that, but it's really still sort of on the ground. So those are just a couple of ideas off the top of my head. It's an interesting question, right? Because I think that there's a conspiratorial mindset, like, well, they don't teach financial literacy because they don't want people understanding how the system works, and it keeps them down. It's like, well, you're giving them too much credit. Like the teachers don't understand it either, right? So there's nobody to teach it. So it's much easier to explain in that way, right? Like there's no point, you know what I mean? Like so I think that not much has changed. That's the short answer. But it's not, I would guard against a conspiratorial explanation and more towards the ignorance explanation. Yeah. First of all, everyone needs to work within their sphere of influence, and if people are more comfortable being like the guy who got me into Bitcoin, nobody knows who he is, right? Like he's absolutely silent and anonymous. But like I'm a lifelong educator, so I speak from my own perspective, right? Like I've been teaching high school mathematics for 20 years. Often to students against their will, like they don't want to be in the room, right? So it's just natural for me to want to like educate and teach people, and that's why I decided to become write a book, and because I wanted a resource for people to help understand it. And I feel like the key is once you really get it, you want other people to like benefit from that knowledge too, and you don't want to keep it to yourself necessarily. Or if you see an opportunity to influence a government official to say, like, this is a policy that I think we should, institute, or the policy that you're trying to institute is actually harmful, and here's why. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think that it's probably what, we need people doing that, and it's not for everybody. So I totally respect somebody who's like, yeah, I just want to buy my Bitcoin and be anonymous and not have anybody know who I am. I get that. But it feels like I have sort of a magic potion that I'm keeping to myself if I don't tell people about it. And I want people to try to understand. I think that another gift of Bitcoin is not just like you understand Bitcoin. If you truly want to understand Bitcoin, you have to understand more about the current financial system. And so this is where a lot of people start learning about how things actually work. And I think that knowledge is very powerful. I really never argue the value proposition of Bitcoin based on its US dollar denominated price. So, like when people say it's up or down, or Bitcoin's up or gold is down, or vice versa, for me personally, that's not where the value is, right? I think that the value of Bitcoin being a digital asset that you can send around the world instantly for pretty much zero fees compared to gold is a inherent value and use case beyond what gold can do. I would never say somebody they should sell all their gold and buy Bitcoin. That's fine. If you like gold, you can like gold, but that's no reason not to learn more about Bitcoin too. I think that there's things that Bitcoin can do, like it's harder to confiscate, it's easier to move, it's easier to validate, right? It improves on gold in a lot of ways. But gold has been around for, 6,000 years, and there's a reason for that, right? So, I just don't know that it has to be one or the other. So for the people in your ear, just because the price went up recently doesn't mean that invalidates the Bitcoin thesis. The Bitcoin thesis isn't about its US dollar price. It's about the value that it adds to everyday people and the opportunities it gives them. So that's what my response would be.
Since embarking on this journey of writing a book, releasing a revised and updated edition, how have you, if at all, changed where you currently sit on the political spectrum?
I haven't a lot, or not in any meaningful way. What I have done is understand some of the futility wrapped into our system of government as it is. I have more frustration with sort of our elected representatives than I would normally, or did before I got into Bitcoin. It doesn't change sort of like what my values are. It doesn't change my principles. It doesn't change the things that caused me to write the book. It just maybe highlights to me that the two political parties in our country don't necessarily align with my values, and they're both very ineffective. And I'll be more clear about that. Like our system of government and the government that I would aspirationally want to see, it's okay if there's inefficiencies. Like I'm okay with that. A lot of people would argue, well, the government's inefficient. Yeah, it's supposed to be. It's taking care of all the shit that like companies don't get to profit from, right? That means it's going to be inefficient. But like the ineffectiveness of our political process is bothersome to me. And so there's more frustration now that I'm a Bitcoiner. It's easier for me to break rules that exist in my life that are for no reason. So I have these Bitcoiner moments, like, do not use this exit. Like, I'm a Bitcoiner, I'm using this exit now, right? And so it's like, there's no reason. I'm not hurting anybody, right? Now, that doesn't make me a full-fledged libertarian, but, it doesn't, change my political stance. But that does change sort of how I walk through the world a little bit, has shifted. But like Bitcoin itself hasn't changed any of my like foundational principles that I hold very important to me. It does make me question the systems that we have in place that sort of are meant to be the manifestation of my principles, which I don't think are. So I ask a lot more questions. I'm a lot more skeptical now. I don't follow rules that just exist to be rules as much. But, like the things I wrote in the book, after being around Bitcoin circles and talking to all sorts, hundreds of people in the Bitcoin space, it's not as if I'm changing my stance on really big foundational things. It's just sort of shifting the way I look at the system. Until I found Bitcoin, I was more of a rule follower than I am now. Like, I think that's true. I'm making that claim. Now, that's anecdotal, and maybe there's like sort of confirmation bias there. But certainly now, when I break a rule, I think of myself as a Bitcoiner, so I don't know the answer for that for sure, but I definitely think that in my mind, I was way more of a rule follower. I didn't want people mad at me. I didn't want to upset people. I was just going to do what they said, kind of thing. I don't want anybody to feel uncomfortable. And I feel like that happens a lot less in my life now. So, and I count that as a win. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for all of your questions. Great discussion. Again, Jason, thank you so much for coming here, sharing your insights with clarity, with passion. Let's give Jason another round of applause. Thanks.